Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Many thanks again now to Professor Schloss for speaking to us on the very last of our lectures from this weekend, God and Biology. Professor Schloss is Professor of Biology from Westmont University and has been very much involved in the science-religion discussion in terms of its context and links with evolutionary biology now for many years. So we're delighted he's speaking to us this afternoon on a slightly different title from the one in your programs, but quite related. His title is Evolutionary Evil and a Good Creation with a question mark. Thanks, Joe.
Well, again, it's wonderful to be with you. There's a slight irony in being the last talk at the end of a long weekend on a warm Sunday afternoon. I wonder if that itself is part of the problem of evil. In any case, I don't think it's an overstatement to say that historically, one of, if not the greatest challenges to religious belief, and in fact, challenges to wisdom traditions, even secular wisdom traditions that viewed the cosmos as a morally purposeful entity, has been the problem of natural evil. In the wake of Darwinism and following the Victorian transition in the mid-1800s, there's really been a profound shift in the way our culture has viewed the assertions of a morally meaningful cosmos. In fact, the word cosmos itself means ordered or attractive, from which we get our word cosmetics. And there's been a shift to viewing the cosmos perhaps as a chaos instead of a cosmos. And I want to examine some of the ways in which an evolutionary view of life either has contributed to that challenge or is represented as having contributed in ways that it may actually not be contributing. And that is to say, it may be that certain nihilistic views of life are piggybacking on evolutionary theory in a way that is not entailed by the theory itself. This transition that I'm talking about is embodied wonderfully in this statement from Tennyson's epic poem In Memoriam. He speaks of us humans who trusted God was love indeed, and love, creation's final law. Though nature red in tooth and claw, that famous phrase, with ravin shrieked against his creed. This round of green, this orb of flame, this earth, this sun. Fantastic beauty such as lurks in some wild poet when he works without a conscience or an aim. This is a crisis of faith for Tennyson, which he was working out in his epic poem. I want to say, by the way, that this was written several years before the origin, so it's not altogether appropriate to place these systemic cultural doubts at the feet of Darwin, although his thinking emerged in their context and certainly furthered it. In fact, Darwin himself, in a letter to Hooker, wrote famously, "What a book a devil's chaplain might write on the clumsy, wasteful, blundering, low, and horribly cruel works of nature." And his colleague and greatest defender, Thomas Huxley, wrote, "The animal world is on about the same level as a gladiator's show. The Hobbesian war of each against all is the normal state of existence." If you can just catch a sense of profound upheaval, not only in the contrast of millennia of viewing the world as God's good creation, but even in the context of a switch from the romantic affirmation of nature as somehow imbued with love at its essence. A year before Huxley wrote this, he wrote in a personal letter, "You see a meadow rich in flower and foliage, and your memory rests upon it as an image of peaceful beauty. It's a delusion. Not a bird twitters, but is either slayer or slain. Not a moment passes in that a holocaust in every hedge and every copse, battle, murder, and sudden death are the order of the day." Now, one of the things I want to point out in the beginning is that each of these people, Tennyson and Darwin and Huxley, wrote these things in the wake of an unanticipated and tragic loss of a loved one. Darwin lost his daughter Annie to an early death. Tennyson wrote In Memoriam in the wake of the loss of his best friend as a sophomore in college in a drowning accident. And Huxley wrote this 1887 reflection shortly after his daughter died in early death. So at the same time, I want to not, well, I think I want to respect the personal pain which gave rise to these views of the world, but also acknowledge that these views of the world in any of us aren't solely located in a dispassionate analysis of the natural facts. Now this tradition is continued to the present day. This may be one of the most famous and often quoted affirmations of Richard Dawkins. This particular piece actually was quoted in Science, although it came originally from his book, River Out of Eden. The universe we have has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but blind, pointless indifference. So what we want to look at in the time remaining, boy, that's fun, isn't it? We want to look at why it is, in the context of an evolutionary view of the world, people would be making these statements. And there are really kind of two reasons. One is that it's claimed that an evolutionary view of the world magnifies our understanding of the abundance of evil, but also it disillusions us and makes us see that there really is a dearth of natural goodness. In fact, philosopher John Otis has said in the wake of Darwin, the problem of natural evil was turned on its head. Evil could be assumed. What became now was the problem of goodness. How on earth it is, in a thoroughgoing Darwinian view of the world, goodness could even get a foothold. Now we can amplify this a little bit. The abundance of evil has two components. First of all, the extensiveness of evil, just how much of it there is. But perhaps more important than that, the centrality of evil. That is to say, the role it plays in nature's economy when viewed through a Darwinian lens. And then secondly, with respect to the dearth of goodness, well, it's claimed by at least some Darwinian representations of the world that it entails an absence of natural beneficence or altruism, and that it also entails moral purposelessness and cosmic dysteleology. I want to look with you at the first three of those. That last one is a really fascinating issue, but a separate talk altogether, and Simon's first talk dealt a bit with that. Now, with respect to the extensiveness of evil, there are several scientific observations that have gone into fueling this. And I want to say I'm going to range in this talk between the theoretical and the just kind of down home. Here it is. The first one is, and this is kind of the discovery of parasitoid natural history. And we didn't always know about this. By the way, a parasitoid is a parasite that feeds on its host to the point intrinsically of killing the host. And the famous parasite is the ichneumon wasp, which lays its eggs in a caterpillar. The eggs hatch, and then the larvae of the eggs actually feed on the living tissue of the caterpillar and eat themselves slowly outside of the caterpillar. Darwin himself says, "I cannot persuade myself that a beneficent and omnipotent God would have designedly created the ichneumony with the express intention of their feeding within the living bodies of caterpillars." This example became an icon, actually, of natural evil during the period of Darwin. I do want to point out that in Darwin's case here, at least this quote, he wasn't saying he couldn't believe there was a God. He just believed that the mode that God used to recreate the world, he couldn't believe was special creation, where he created each individual organism with the intention that they should live this way. Secondly, around the same period, there was the discovery of the biotic nature of the tropics. I mean, most biology was done by Western Europeans at the time, and the discovery of the tropics was really an eye-opener in many ways in its distinction from the manicured, temperate landscape of British and continental realms. There are, and I'm just for fun going to limit myself to organisms that I have experienced personally. So this is a bullet ant, nothing like this in temperate regions. It's an inch long. It's called a bullet ant because if it bites you, you feel like you've been shot. Some of the local people in Central and South America also call it the 24-hour ant because for 24 hours you wish that you were dead. I was on a hike in Costa Rica with a woman, and one dropped out of the trees into her blouse, down her bra, actually. She screamed in mortal pain, but was powerless to do anything about it, given her modesty. And I remember thinking, oh, I'm so glad I'm not her. And about 5 minutes later, one dropped out of the tree and turned to me as well. And it literally knocked me to the ground. It feels like somebody grabbed you with a pair of pliers, squeezed and twisted. It was black and blue for many days after that. Well, I'm not going to tell you each story, but of course my scorpions, Portuguese man of war, they vary in size. Some of them have tentacles for 40 feet, which I have encountered myself. Now this is an interesting organism, the botfly. The botfly has eggs resting on the bottom of insects, which when they, mosquitoes or other organisms, which when they land on you, your body heat melts the glue that attaches the egg to the mosquito, and then the egg finds its way into the mosquito bite. It hatches and the larva feeds on you from the inside. It's very much like the wasp, except it doesn't kill you. Although if you let it go long enough, you might wish that you were dead. It's about an 8-week incubation period. I came back after one trip to the tropics with 3 botfly bites, and I thought, I'm a biologist, I'm very curious. I would like to let this come to term and see it emerge. And furthermore, I've never given birth to anything. So, about the 6th week, and I began to read up on this, after about 5 weeks, these become excruciatingly painful. They have little barbs in them so that you can't press themselves out. And every time they move, you feel the barbs dig into you. And my wife was continually waking her up at night because in my sleep I would scream when they would become mobile. So she made me go get them cut out. And I've always been somewhat scarred from that abortion. There's a case where it hasn't been cut out. It's emerging from the eye. And of course, my favorite here is the group of poison dart or poison arrow frogs, Dendrobatus. They're strikingly colored. The most poisonous toxin on Earth actually comes from a related genus Phylobot baits, terrible. They're actually not dangerous unless they don't permeate the skin, but if you have an open sore, or if you put it on an arrow and it permeates the skin, it's very dangerous, powerful neurotoxin. This lower one here is fairly rare, and I was with the students in the tropics once, and there was one hopping across the path, and I scooped it up, and what I often do is, to show it to students, I'll cup it with my hands and shake it up. It doesn't injure the organism, but it disorients them. Then I can hold it out and they can watch it. I've done this countless times with different dendrobates, and it so happens I'd forgotten that a few minutes before I had lost my footing on a trail and reached out to grab myself, but it was a thorn palm, so I had a big puncture in my hole, and I was holding this frog for a while, and everybody taking pictures, and walked down the path a few minutes later, and ooh, I just fell over, and here I am. I'm glad, but
Natural selection.
Darwin Awards. So, when I take students to the Rocky Mountains or Sierras or the Alpine region, I oftentimes find myself spontaneously singing to myself a hymn. This is my Father's world. And I have to say, I'm being somewhat facetious, but not altogether. My first few trips to the tropic, I found myself singing a different hymn. This world is not my home. There is an aspect of nature which really is red in tooth and claw. This was discovered in the 1800s and dramatically contributed to the change in the perception of the nature of the biological world. Now, I should say none of this has anything to do with Darwinism, but it's a very real input. And lastly, in terms of just observations, was the discovery of the fossil record. A dramatic influence on the view of nature, both in terms of the sheer amount and the scale of destruction. So in his poem, In Memoriam, there's this one point where Tennyson was reflecting on the rampant nature of death, and if there were a God, doesn't he care about any of his creatures? And then he says, well, he tried to seek solace in the thought that he may not care about the individual, but he cares about the type. And then he talks about how Scarped Cliff cried against this assurance, that he doesn't even care about the type. Massive obliteration of species in the fossil record. So the sheer amount and scale of destruction, but also, and perhaps maybe even most theologically important, at least to the Abrahamic faith, the primordial place of death. With the discovery of the fossil record, it simply was untenable to think that somehow death followed in the wake of human sin, that it was a post hoc incursion into a wholly different kind of creation at another point. Now, Dennis actually gives a wonderful talk on biblical perspectives on the nature of evil, the origin of death. I'm not going to do that. I want to focus on the more generic inferences that we make from these observations. Dawkins has an extended meditation on this. He says the total amount of suffering per year in the natural world is beyond all decent contemplation. During the minute it takes me to compose this sentence, thousands of animals are being eaten alive. Others are running for their lives, whimpering with fear, slowly being devoured from within by grasping parasites, and thousands of all kinds are dying of starvation, thirst, and disease. David Hull, in an essay published in Nature, this is one of the most elegant and acerbic assertions of this point of view, I think, that I've encountered from modern thinkers. Hull says the evolutionary process is rife with happenstance, contingency, incredible death, pain, and horror. Millions of sperm and ova are produced that never unite to form a zygote. 95% of the DNA an organism contains has no function. I'd want to know from Francis if that's true.
Not anymore.
Yeah. Whatever the God implied by evolutionary theory and the data of natural history may be like, he is not a loving God who cares about his productions. Careless, wasteful, indifferent, almost diabolical. He is certainly not the sort of God to whom anyone would be inclined to pray. I want to make a couple of comments on this. First of all, in none of my comments do I want to minimize the genuine problem of natural evil. In fact, and this is the one point in the talk where I will be personal, one of my responses to Hull's comment is that he actually does minimize the problem. My own roots, my family is Jewish Holocaust survivors. I have several hundred miles from here stood in the Jewish graveyard of the hometown of my father and held my father in my arms as he wept in front of the empty graves of his family who never made it out of Germany. In the context of that, I have to be frank, the fact that millions of sperm don't find an ova doesn't trouble me. Now you might say, well, yeah, but that's moral evil. But natural evil, and I beg your indulgence here, but I have a good friend of 25 years from Westmont College, and a couple of years ago he lost his son, who played with my son when they were growing up, to a tragic early death. And then just a week before this conference, he found out that his wife has a brain tumor. She has 6 months to live. Now my response was, that's too much evil for one life. And in fact, I struggled with whether to come to the conference or not, or whether I needed to be there with Alan during this time. But there's, I suspect that this is the level that most of us engage the problem of natural evil. And the fact that sperm don't find ova, and I'm not meaning to be dismissive, seems really to be a red herring, almost an offensive red herring. The second quick comment on Hull's statement is this, well, of course he's doing theology, isn't he, ultimately, and he's also doing psychology, a rather presumptuous psychology when he talks about this is not the kind of God anyone would be inclined to pray to. It might be more honest if he had said, "Is not the kind of God I imagine behind this process is not the kind of God I would want to pray to." But this notion of speaking of careless and wasteful, there's some interesting assumptions here. In particular, the judgment of waste is a teleological judgment. Something becomes wasteful if it doesn't make appropriate use of resources toward a given end. But in fact, if there is no God, there are no ends. If there is a God, then presumably we would need to consult him about what his ends are. So the question of pain is something different. But the question of waste is not a question, I think, that can be raised without a lot of homework that Hall isn't doing here. Now, I want to make some specific scientific responses to the 3 points I made earlier. First of all, in terms of parasitoid natural history, no question that was discovered. Interestingly, we have complementary discoveries in terms of the natural history of mutualism. My original training, by the way, was in the ecology of the lichen symbiosis. So that's what I did my field work in. That actually has a very interesting history. It was discovered about the same time as the Ichneumon wasp was discovered. But it was resisted for almost 100 years. People simply didn't believe that such a thing like symbiosis or mutualism could be possible. So what I want to point out is our theoretical pre-commitments actually very much colored the way we viewed the world and what we were even willing to believe was possible in the world. So empirically we have the observations at the same time, but the affirmation of the existence of mutualism and symbiosis took about a century longer to come into play. Secondly, in terms of tropical armaments, again, no question that's the case, but then I would also ask, which tropics are we talking about? So I dropped out of college for a while and lived in the South Pacific. That's a very different tropics, by the way. None of these creatures that I have just mentioned are there. In fact, the terrestrial creatures in the tropics, there's virtually nothing there that would hurt you at all. So the world is patchy. And it's dangerous scientifically, but also theologically, to try to characterize the world on the basis of one particular patch. And then lastly, I'd want to make the distinction between extinction and the manifold or extensive nature of death and suffering. As much as the fossil record does testify to extinction, in terms of the actual magnitude of death, it doesn't change matters at all. The fact is, the total amount of death in the history of the world is exactly equal to 1 per organism that has ever lived. And the fact that species have become extinct doesn't make that problem any worse in and of itself. Now, Dawkins says that, points out that DNA survival is not the recipe for happiness. So long as DNA is passed on, it does not matter who or what gets hurt in the process. Genes don't care about suffering because they don't care about anything. If nature were kind, she would at least make the minor concession of anesthetizing caterpillars before they are eaten from within. It's easy to imagine a gene that, say, tranquilizes gazelles when they are about to suffer a killing bite. It's hard to see why this should be so, and we may therefore guess that gazelles suffer horrible pain and fear when they are pursued to the death, as most of them eventually are. Again, one of my purposes in the talk, there are some genuine problems that evolutionary theory raises, and there are also some ways that evolutionary theory is used by those who are exegeting it. This is a really interesting quote. First of all, it's not clear to me at all why nature should anesthetize caterpillars before they are eaten alive, because it's not clear that they actually suffer pain from that process. And this is a very interesting proposition, the idea of a gene that tranquilizes gazelles. Now, Dawkins imagines, because he can't imagine a way that natural selection could create such a gene, since how would it contribute to the reproductive success of the organism? However, ultimately, this isn't a matter of imagining. This is just a matter of empirically. Is there any evidence that such things do exist? I wouldn't have guessed that there were, but around the time of Darwin, David Livingstone was actually attacked by a lion, and here's an account of that attack from his journals. I saw the lion just in the act of springing upon me. He caught my shoulder as he sprang, and we both came to the ground below together. Growling horribly close to my ear, he shook me as a terrier dog does a rat. The shock produced a stupor, and it caused a sort of dreaminess in which there was no sense of pain nor feeling of terror. The particular state is probably produced in all animals killed by the carnivore, and if so, is a merciful provision by our benevolent Creator for lessening the pain of death. Now, what we have at work here is two metaphysical programs, I guess, and this is how Livingstone imagines or wishes the world would be, although it's based on his experience. Dawkins imagines the world to be different. And the question is there any empirical data that the world actually does work the way that Livington suggested? And that it took us 100 years. There actually is, in fact. In the neural gate theory of pain, we discovered mechanisms in the spinal cord that work this way, and more recently the discovery of endogenous opioids. Now, how it is that evolution would produce such a mechanism, and what actually a gazelle is experiencing when that happens, we don't know. But I think I do want to posit the possibility, for example, these could be spandrels or pleiotropic byproducts of pain attenuation mechanisms that do have survival benefit, that are nevertheless present in the experience of death. When Dawkins says DNA survival is not the recipe for happiness, and genes don't care about anything, well, what genes care about actually isn't the question, is it? The question is, if there is a God, what does God care about, and what of those cares are genes and the products of natural selection competent to produce? And it may, in fact, be the case that DNA survival is the recipe for happiness. This seems to be actually more of an autobiographical statement than it does to be a scientific statement. So first of all, I guess we would want to ask, we all are the products of DNA survival, and is life, in fact, a potentially joyous, flourishing experience for those who have it? Any of us are free to relinquish it at any point. So that is clearly not a scientific statement, and maybe more of an autobiographical statement. Okay, and lastly, a quick theological response. All this notwithstanding, it is the case that the fossil record is there, and it testifies to something like it's not news, actually. The biblical view of God, however you take the Noahic flood story, for example, is suggested of a radically undomesticated post-diluvian God. It didn't take the fossil record to convince us that there's been tremendous destruction. In fact, I don't know what to do with this myself, and whether or not you believe that a Noahic flood actually occurred. The story is in the Christian, Jewish, and Islamic scriptures of a God who exercises the prerogative of simply laying waste to his entire creation. C.S. Lewis in his Narnia Chronicles has at one point someone asking if the lion Aslan is safe, and the response is, he isn't safe, but he's good. And it may be that through the period of Romanticism, we had far too tame a God, and that we may need space for a wilder, but nevertheless good God. Secondly, there's a question of who is authorized to give definitive exegesis of creation. One of the things that is pointed out by a number of critics of recent exegesis of evolutionary theory, and by the way, not just by religious critics, is that for some reason evolutionary theorists are doing more than simply proposing causal mechanisms for the origin of life, but are using the theory as of a lens for decoding the ultimate significance or meaning of life. Well, it's not clear that that's the authoritative lens, first of all, and second of all, what's the prescription of the lens? That is to say, what version of evolutionary theory do we use to do that authoritative decoding? Okay, I said that there was another question in terms of evil, and I have to say this first series, I think, are largely red herrings. First of all, they're not exclusively due to evolutionary theory, and secondly, I think they're oftentimes exaggerated, or at least the emphasis is placed in wrong areas. But this is a different topic altogether. This observation is a genuine implication of evolutionary theory, and it argues the following: that not only is there a lot more evil, both extensively and in terms of time, than we would have guessed, but the role of what is called natural evil is very important, is very different and more central in the workings of nature. At one point, biblical theists viewed natural evil, death and destruction, as somehow a post hoc incursion upon or addition to a creation that didn't have that. We now know historically that isn't true, but also there's the suggestion that for nature to even work, it has to not only be there to begin with, but it's the very engines or driving force of the workings of natural evil. We could say it this way, that competition is the engine of evolutionary change, and death is the requisite fuel for the fire. Well, that really is a very different picture of nature. And I want to make some responses to that. First of all, the primordial nature of death and struggle are unarguable. And that's something that biblical theists simply need to come to grips with. Although, by the way, even in the biblical tradition, there is nothing like unanimity on believing that death was only recent. But it's actually, it turns out from an evolutionary perspective, death is not the requisite fuel for the fire. Natural selection doesn't require death. You could imagine natural selection could in fact go on in a landscape where organisms were immortal. All natural selection requires is differential reproduction of genotypes. That is to say, whether you live or die, what natural selection takes is that some genotypes lead more offspring than others. And in principle, you don't have to have death for natural selection to occur. Now, in a finite world, for it to occur very long, you do have to have death. But natural selection itself doesn't require death. In fact, the evolutionary theory of death is very much the reverse. The evolutionary theory of death that argues that there has been natural selection for death to be internalized because it pays off for the organism to internalize what's going to happen anyways. That is to say, if there are external sources of mortality, that it makes, if you only have 20 years to live, you better spend your resources in the first 20 years. And then, so that's called the evolutionary theory of aging. There's another theory of aging called the rate of living theory. But most evolutionary biologists subscribe to the first. Death isn't necessary for natural selection. In fact, it may be the product of natural selection. More importantly, actually natural selection is not equal to competition. Now this may be a little bit counterintuitive, or to reverse this, strictly speaking, competition is not necessary for natural selection. Competition defined ecologically is this. Competition is a situation in which the presence of two individuals, either the same species or different species, each negatively influence the fitness of the other. Competition is a situation in which the presence of two individuals negatively influence the fitness or reproductive success of the other. You don't have to have that for natural selection to occur. By the way, if you do have that, and you have heritable variants that allow one individual to produce more than the other, you'll have natural selection. But for example, you can have natural selection by simply the discovery of new niches that don't involve competition at all. Where one individual discovers a new niche, discovering that new niche doesn't negatively influence the fitness of another. In fact, it may positively influence the fitness of another. Exploiting that new niche may leave extra resources for the conspecific or the other species. And you can also have a cooperative synergy where organisms cooperate either to generate new niches or new resources. Now, I'm not saying that competition doesn't inform natural selection. I am saying that it isn't the only driving force, and it isn't even necessary driving force for natural selection. So those are scientific responses. And in terms of theological responses, well, I would want to affirm that death is primordial, but it is theologically neither fundamental nor final. And this is a theological assertion. There's no way to verify it or falsify it empirically, but in terms of our making sense of death, it's important to decide what we believe about this. That is to say, in saying that although death is primordial, it's ancient, by saying it's not fundamental, it's saying that, that ultimately life has not emerged out of non-life. Life has emerged out of life. That is to say, the living God has created an abiotic substrate which may have generated life, but the ultimate source of life is life, the portrayal in the biblical tradition of God. And that's an important gerund there as the living God. And nor is it final, eschatologically. Second, this isn't a point that only theists made. There are a number of critics of recent evolutionary theory that raised the question, well, why are we characterizing nature as red in tooth and claw? It may be equally characterized as green in shoot and ball. In other words, in fact, going back to David Hull's notion of millions of sperm never finding an ovum. Well, we could say that about millions of seeds never germinating, or millions of eggs laid by insects never coming to adulthood. Nature is, in fact, extravagantly fertile. Now, it's not clear to me whether that's an evil thing, or whether it reflects, in fact, divine blessing, be fruitful and multiply. So again, those aren't empirical judgments. Those are fundamental judgments that ensue from our posture toward, interpretive posture toward the world. I'm not going to say much about this except to recommend the philosopher of biology Hans Jonas, who argues that the very meaning of life is that it is strenuous being, unlike a rock which has its being simply by being a rock. Living organisms are agents that, in a sense, I'm not going to say choose, but that pursue being against the threat of non-being, which for a living organism means death. And in fact, the existence of death or struggle, well, in one sense, it is evil. And as I contemplate the death of loved ones. In another sense, Jonas argues that the very fact of livingness is distinguishable by its counter position to the abyss of non-being. And there's something marvelous about the capacity of living organisms to pursue this mode of being in the context of environmental challenge. And lastly, I just want to mention, and I don't want to be glib or saccharine here, but I want to mention the notion of redeeming death. Now, there's no question that death exists, but it didn't take evolution to tell us that. There's no question that there's lots of it, one per organism. It didn't take evolution to tell us that. It's argued by some that the role of death in evolutionary theory somehow makes it worse. But we could have a different interpretation of that, in fact, altogether. Prior to evolutionary theory, death was something that simply happened to each organism. In the context of evolutionary theory, we now see that out of the death of organisms, and by the way, if the world were 10,000 years old and species were created pretty much as they are now, while in some respects that seems to minimize the problem of death, I actually think it maximizes it. Because nothing good comes out of that process of death. Whatever we have now, we had 10,000 years ago, and presumably we could have it without death. But if the pageant of evolution has occurred over billions of years, and we have new species coming onto the scene, and unlike Michael, actually, I would argue, not from an anthropocentric perspective, but from what Hans Jonas calls a generically zoocentric perspective, in terms of noting the qualities of life. Jonas talks about the intensification of biotic potency. That life is not just a quality, but it's a quantity that can be manifested in greater measure of homeostatic control, sensory awareness, behavioral flexibility. Those things have increased over evolutionary time. And, by the way, could not have occurred without death. So the theologian Holmes Rolston talks about the cruciform nature of creation. that in fact, in the natural world, not to minimize the anguish of death, but out of death does come good. For the Christian tradition, this is most abundantly evidenced in the cross. I would argue that the pageant of evolutionary history also reflects this. At least something good comes out of death. And in another sense, it happened at lunch today. So what we are eating today were the products of photosynthesis that has occurred in touch with the soil of thousands of years of dead organisms. In fact, you may have been eating carbon that was in the body of one of your ancestors today. Pleasant thought. Okay, lastly, I want to conclude with some observations on this other question, evolution and altruism. It's claimed by evolutionary theorists that actually that we shouldn't, not only is there lots of bad stuff, but if the world works the way a thoroughgoing Darwinian understanding of the world suggests it should work, there should be no good stuff. That is to say, there should be an absence of beneficence. Here's the theoretical problem. Darwin himself observed, here's a quote from him, he says, "The existence of a characteristic in one organism that functions for the exclusive benefit of another organism would quote-unquote annihilate my theory, because natural selection could never explain such a characteristic." A century later, E.O. Wilson picked that up in sociobiology, in his book Sociobiology, and he acknowledged that by and large we're still working on that the radical sacrifice or altruism question hadn't been solved. I mentioned this the last lecture, but E.O. Wilson called this, the altruism question, quote-unquote, the central theoretical issue in sociobiology. David Otis, I mentioned him before, says, "For followers of Darwin, the familiar theological problem of evil was turned inside out. Evil could henceforth be assumed, and the existential paradox which demanded explanation became, in fact, the problem of goodness." Now, we've had a number of breakthroughs, even in the last several decades, that basically, in two steps. The first step was the step of convincing people that, in fact, we could explain all of these apparent instantiations of beneficence as self-interest. I'm not talking, by the way, about caring for one's infants. That's very lovely as it is, very easy to understand reproductive benefit to. But I'm talking about radical care for those from whom no compensatory return or no reproductive benefit is imaginable. Michael Gisel famously says, "If natural selection is both sufficient and true, it's impossible for a genuinely disinterested or altruistic behavior pattern to evolve." That would be the nexus of the question here. Natural selection is sufficient and true, no altruism. Well, there have been some theoretical breakthroughs. The first one Francis mentioned the other day is kin selection. And the logic of kin selection simply works like this. It makes sense for me to sacrifice if the level of benefit to the recipient times the index of genetic relatedness more than compensates for the sacrifice. So J.B.S. Haldane was doodling on a napkin in a pub one night, and he says, "I'll gladly sacrifice my life for 2 brothers or 8 cousins." That's the logic of kin selection. By the way, earlier accounts of that story have him saying, "I gladly sacrifice my life for 2 brothers or 4 cousins." That turns out to be wrong, because the index of genetic relatedness between cousins is 0.125. I'm not sure what he really said, but the earliest versions say 4, and then it's been sanitized. There's a tremendously powerful insight. I wish I had time to discuss some of the observations and predictions and confirmations that kin selection theory makes, most notably the explanation of sterile casts and social insects. But it's also been a dramatically overused and misunderstood insight. For example, there are some social scientists who try to use kin selection to explain racial antagonism. And as Francis was saying the other day, there's probably not enough genetic differentiation between racial groups to explain this at all. But clearly people and organisms just don't cooperate with kin. Hence the emergence of reciprocal altruism theory by Robert Trivers. And the logic is kind of similar. The degree of sacrifice for another has to be less than the benefit back to the actor times the likelihood of a compensatory return. Basically, I scratch your back, you scratch mine. And again, in reciprocal altruism theory, there actually has been a fair amount of fruitful empirical work here with non-human species. Some very surprising results and some really interesting results of species that we would never have expected this to be the case. From vampire bats to the groupers and cleaner wrasses that I showed you a picture of earlier, who actually can keep track of which individuals return the favor, and if they don't return the favor, they don't cooperate again. These two pieces of insight generated a revolution called in sociobiology, and it represented a revolution which a number of people, Richard Alexander, for example, at University of Michigan, describes these insights as equivalent in importance to Darwin's original insights, of generating a second Darwinian revolution, because prior to them, Alexander argues, in fact in a very strongly worded portion, he says anybody who believed in Darwinism prior to these insights was right in believing in Darwinism, but only by coincidence. So important is the explanation of apparently sacrificial behaviors prior to these insights. So inadequate was our ability to explain them that there was not adequate warrant for accepting Darwinism. Now the power of these insights has generated a tremendous triumphalism, what I would call an explanatory triumphalism in sociobiology. David Barash, evolutionary biology is quite clear that what's in it for me is the ancient refrain of all life. We got the goods on life, and Alexander himself says, I suspect that nearly all humans believe it is a normal part of the functioning of every human now and then to assist someone else in the realization of that person's own interest at the actual net expense of the altruist. What the greatest intellectual revolution of the century tells us is that, despite our intuitions, there is not a shred of evidence to support this view of beneficence. And a great deal of convincing theory suggests that any such view will eventually be judged false. Now here's the kicker. There do not seem to be any remaining reasons for invoking anything other than nepotism and favoritism to explain human societal structure. That is to say that everything about human beings can be explained by these two key insights, kin selection, reciprocal altruism. I'm going to argue in a minute that he's just wrong. But even if you were right, I want to point out there's an interesting rhetorical game going on here. He talks about nepotism and favoritism structuring society. Those are highly pejorative terms. Actually, he could have said there's no reasons for invoking anything other than love of family and friendship to account for human societal structure. So there's kind of a nihilistic pejorative representation of these ideas, but certainly also an over-ambitious representation of their explanatory competence. And in fact, that's the next point I want to make before moving on to the last section. It's widely conceded that there's a theoretical incompleteness to these approaches. So Harman Holcomb, a philosopher of biology, who did really the first systematic and comprehensive philosophical assessment of the adequacy of sociobiology, and he's an advocate of sociobiology, by the way, grad student of Elliot Sobers, nevertheless concluded that the problem of an incomplete evolutionary theory is a contradiction between expectations produced by Darwinian selection theory and social data. That is, it would lead us to think that widespread altruism cannot evolve. But we observe that widespread altruism is a fact. Interesting observation of Holcomb's in the mid-90s, and since then, the field has actually moved on into a second generation in the wake of these observations. By the way, the first thing I should mention is that kin selection, which was the original bulwark of this field, many people have even moved on from kin selection. So E.O. Wilson, in a recent argument, has a very moving account of a train ride he took from New York to Florida, reading Hamilton's paper on kin selection. The first time he read it, he thought, couldn't be that simple. The second time he read it, he thought, maybe so. The third time he read it, he thought, my goodness, this person has solved it. And for 30 years, the field was pretty sold on kin selection, at least as a explanation of eusociality in the Hymenoptera. And Wilson is persuaded that it doesn't work anymore. He's invested now in another theory, which we'll talk about in a minute, called group selection. So these second generation theories are of three kinds, and I'm not going to say much about them. I'll go quickly. But the first kind is individual benefit theories, which simply argue that there are things beyond kin selection and reciprocal altruism, but ultimately cooperative, apparently sacrificial behavior always ends up benefiting the individual. So Richard Alexander has mentioned that developed the notion of indirect reciprocity. Same kind of logic. The sacrifice is paid off by a benefit back to the actor. In this case, times the likelihood that that benefit will be increased by reputational enhancement. In other words, I'm going to be good to Dennis, even if he can't return the favor, because Rodney will see me, or he'll hear from Dennis that I'm a good guy, and then Rodney will be good back. So that's the notion of indirect reciprocity. Robert Frank, an economist at Cornell, has developed the notion of hard to fake or emotional signaling. Frank argues, yeah, but indirect reciprocity, I mean, the person who developed indirect reciprocity, Richard Alexander, basically says this: I'm as good as it pays to be, I'm as bad as I can get away with. And Robert Frank says nobody wants to cooperate with that kind of person if you're just calculating how good you need to be. And nobody wants to do business with a business who works like that. You want to cooperate with a person who wants to do good because it's good. So Frank says that, as an economist, he was perplexed by why do people tip in an out-of-town restaurant? Simple little behavior, but they're never going to come back. And Frank has this notion that by genuinely good acts, we develop nonverbal displays of cooperative dispositions, which are read by others. You can't fake them. You have to really have them. But they end up paying off. So, in Proverbs it says, basically saying that virtue is its own reward. But it's not virtue if you pursue it for the sake of reward. Are you with me? So it's a payoff. And actually there are a number of mathematical models, and there are even some empirical studies to suggest that there's warrant to this. But none of this explains the kind of sacrifice that doesn't pay off for the individual. So I would say they're all true, all these, and all widely affirmed. There's no news here. Most of us have had this view of human nature to begin with. They're actually all helpful, but they're all incomplete. They fail to explain the existence of altruism that doesn't pay off for the individual. Kristen Monroe, in her most systematic, I think has conducted the most systematic study of Holocaust rescuers. She concludes at the end of that study, my overall conclusion concerning biological explanations is that they have nothing to contribute to our understanding of the more extreme forms of altruistic behavior. The individualistic paradigm and implicit assumption of self-interest on which Darwinian biology is based appears unable to account for situations of genuine sacrifice for people not of one's kin or social group. So really, and by the way, she has no theological axe to ground. She's not an anti-evolutionist. She just believes that these paradigms don't explain what she observed. So I'm going to skip through these two last points. But in response to these observations, one development has been the notion of group selection. That natural selection favors behaviors that benefit the group, but not necessarily the individual. And it would work like this. One way of maximizing your salary, let's say you're an NBA basketball player, is by being the MVP, by being the leading scorer. But you could also help your own salary, although you would make less than the MVP if you had a lot of assists, were always feeding the ball to others, and your team won. Then you get a bonus at the end of the season. So what advocates of group selection are saying is, group selection can cause the emergence of behaviors that really incline me to help you at relative cost to myself compared to you, as long as our team does better than another team. That's the logic. Now, how are we going to assess it? Well, first of all, I want to say, and there's not time to debate this, that it's theoretically coherent, and at least in some limited context, empirically confirmable, although to what extent group selection actually is prevalent in nature, we don't know yet. But there's a dark side of group altruism, and its leading advocate, David Wilson, acknowledges this. You have to have competition between teams. The dark side of in-group cooperation is that it's driven by intergroup hostility. So the firemen in 9/11 in the US rushing up, to giving their lives to save others. Tremendous sacrifice on the part of the group. But by the way, I've only seen this once, but I've seen on TV once. The next day at Ground Zero, there was a banner the size of this wall hanging that said 5,000 reasons to kill them all. That's the dark side of group altruism, the intergroup hostility. And lastly, there are explanatory inadequacies in group altruism. First of all, in order to keep the team working as a team, you have to have policing. David Wilson suggests this. But the interesting thing is the most altruistic acts we have are often not only without policing, but in the face of punishment for being altruistic. Are you with me? So back to Holocaust rescuers. Nobody policed those actions. In fact, those actions were taken in the face of policing action that would exact great harm on them. And secondly, group altruism simply fails to explain radical out-group sacrifice. Firemen rushing up in 9/11 to save their countrymen. I don't want to demean the beauty and the nobility of those actions. But what really it doesn't explain is trying to save your enemy. So in the Christian tradition, there's this, in both Matthew and Luke, there's an extended discourse by Jesus when he says, if you do good to those who do good back to you, what credit is that to you? Tax collectors do the same. If you exchange your greetings to those who exchange that greetings to you, what credit is that? Gentiles do the same. He might, by the way, have said, all social vertebrates do that. But I say to you, be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Pray for those who despitefully use you. Bless those who curse you. Love your enemy. Well, that's what group altruism, group selection can't explain. And I mentioned, by the way, in a recent review in Science, Martin Novak reviews the various positions mathematically that I just described to you. Wonderful job explaining various versions and levels and context of cooperation. We still don't have a scenario to explain radical out-group sacrifice. And to do that, it actually takes memetics. Now, my apologies for the tape, but for the sake, because you've already sat through this, I don't think I want to do it again, except to say that, you know, memetics is not only used to explain religion, it was developed originally to explain why it is that human beings would do this unusual behavior of radical sacrifice to others. Again, Leprito's quote that conceptions of a cultural nature can actually thwart the self-serving thrusts of the gene. Now, how do we want to assess this? Well, on the one hand, memetics gives us genuine behavioral altruism. Behavioral altruism. But on the other hand, it doesn't give us motivational altruism. The fact is, it doesn't give us what Christians would call caritas. And here's why. The way memes are formulated is that just as organisms exist for perpetuating, are just a gene's way of reproducing themselves, a mind's way is just a meme's way of reproducing itself. In fact, memes are entities that infect minds and in some sense make people do things. So the question of agency or motivation is actually completely deconstructed in the face of memetics. I think we lose something precious by a memetic account of altruism, and more often there's a profound contradiction here. At the end of the selfish chain, Dawkins says that we alone have the ability to resist the tyranny of the selfish replicators. The problem is, memes are selfish replicators, at least in Dawkins' view. So it's not clear how a selfish replicator can give us the ability to resist the tyranny of selfish replicators. It's not clear actually that we have a coherent proposal here, although we do have an acknowledgement that genetic reductionism isn't going to get us where as far as explaining the data. And lastly, at least in the mimetic view, altruism becomes an imposition upon rather than a fulfillment of humanity. Now, it may be the case that that's what it is, although it may not be the case. In some sense, I think, I will say as a Christian, but you don't have to be a Christian to this, I want to ask the question whether altruistic regard for others is not just a colonial imposition on a recalcitrant and a hostile substrate, but is in some sense a fulfillment of the deepest things that we were meant to become and embrace. And to conclude in that context, well, we have unreconciled scientific antagonism right now. We have a number of different positions that are duking it out. The interesting thing is these positions also mirror tensions that have existed in theology as well. The tensions are, on the one hand, views that cooperative dispositions are very much a part of who we are by organic nature, but those dispositions are constrained. Versus, on the mimetic view, no, there's unconstrained, but that unconstraint is conferred from something beyond our biological resources. And this actually mirrors debates in Christian theology between Augustinian and Thomistic views of grace, by the way, as radically transforming nature or perfecting nature. That's a conversation that we can have perhaps later. But I want to say that these tensions animating the natural sciences now are centuries-old traditions within theology itself. So there should be no tension here between science and theology. In fact, theology has a history of wrestling with these issues that predates the sciences themselves. And lastly, at least in the sciences right now, most of these approaches are non-organismal. And here's what I mean about this. One axis has a continuum of altruistic extensiveness from kin selection, very limited domain of altruism, all the way to mimetics. But there's also a continuum of how deeply internalized biologically it is. And the natural sciences right now is the more it doesn't pay off reproductively, the more genuinely altruistic it is, the least internalized it is. And this is what we want to ask. Can we come up with an understanding of altruism, genuinely other regard, that is deeply internalized, that is embodied in who we are as creatures? This is a research program, by the way. We don't have answers to this. I think this would be an example of a theologically informed research program. It's not that theology provides the answers. It's not that we're using God to prove a hypothesis, but it is that a theological view of the world might function as a reservoir for ideas about what the world is like. And then, or a treasure map of hypotheses to go digging for. There is some tentative data to suggest that there's something worth digging for. Stephen Post has just published an edited volume with Oxford University Press called Altruism in Health, and has argued that there is evidence for the contribution to human flourishing of altruistic other regard. And Stephanie Brown at University of Michigan with Randy Nesse has actually followed up on some of these longevity surveys that find that people live longer with terminal diseases if they're involved in support groups. What she's found is she segregates the people on what they're doing in the support groups. It's the people who are giving who actually have lower mortality rates. The people who are just receiving actually have higher mortality rates, and that's after it's controlled for initial health going into the groups. So lastly, 3 quick points. I would want to argue that the sociobiological picture might constitute something like a fundament as common grace. So Jesus says, again, even you being evil know how to give good things to your children. By the way, that's not to say that giving good things to your children is evil. It's just that the notion of common grace is that there are certain good things that fall on all of us, no matter what our disposition toward God is. So by common grace, we may have the dispositions to care for family, friends, social group, and that's one of the good things that has been lavished into creation. It may be that agape is a special grace. It may not be, but that's one possibility. And there are various interpretations of special grace, by the way. It doesn't always mean supernatural intervention. And finally, in my last point, was I kind of returning to some kind of neo-romantic, saccharine view of nature, that love is creation's final law, everything's good as long as we love each other. I want to conclude by saying, no, it's more complicated than that. I do actually think, both theologically and empirically, there's a case to be made for caring, being wedded to flourishing as who we are as creatures. But there's a cost for this caring. First of all, self-relinquishing extension of love costs us. I want to loop all the way back to the beginning of the talk and say I don't think this is a solution to the problem of evil. But I think the existence, the very existence of our capacity to suffer is wedded to a good creation in two ways. First of all, we could never do this. We could never manifest self-relinquishing care for those we love unless, what does relinquishing mean? It means suffering on behalf of what we value. So in the Old Testament, by the way, there's a story there where King David is about to give a sacrifice, and his friend says, "Here, let me give the sacrifice, provide the sacrifice for you." And David says, "Far be it from me to provide a sacrifice to the Lord that costs me nothing." So the very existence of our capacity for pain and suffering actually gives us a resource that we can relinquish on behalf of those we love. I wouldn't wish suffering for anyone I love, but it certainly adds a dimension to love if somebody can suffer for us. If love didn't involve any capacity for relinquishment, genuine sacrifice or suffering, somehow that would seem to disembowel the very meaning of love. And secondly, well, there is a self-destructive denial of love. When we either reject it or are denied it, that does hurt. Kierkegaard says, there is no love that does not contain with it the possibility of offense. And we can be offended two ways. We can be offended by rejecting it, in which case we suffer. And we can be offended by needing it and not receiving it. And what we see over the course of evolutionary history, by the way, is the progressive capacity for attachment, to make investment in others, but along with that, the progressive intensification of ability to feel pain at being denied attachment. I'm not convinced that's a bad thing, though it may be a painful thing. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Jeff, very much indeed for that. We do have some time for questions, so we'd like to ask the question over here. Yes.
So when we were looking at predators, are predators suggesting any kind of relation between intelligence and evil in any sense?
Predators?
Predators.
The example of, for example, larvae-eating caterpillar. Does it suggest that they had the intelligence to develop a strategy where they are better at it?
No. Especially in the parasitoids, nobody is suggesting that parasitoid have intentions. I think the problem is, with intentionality, Darwin's problem was, it's not that the wasps have intentions. He found it difficult to believe that a creator could have made these organisms with his intention that they function that way.
Yes, question.
Is there any evidence that other organisms have memes or mimetic?
Fascinating question. And I want to say, first of all, with no disrespect, I'm not sure there's evidence that humans have memes. And I really mean that. I'm not saying that there's anti-evidence. It's just that I don't know how we would amass evidence on that right now. Having said that, there is no evidence that other organisms have memes, and its majority doesn't rule in science. But right now, memetics is an idea that is applied exclusively to humans. Now, having said that, I should say that there have been a couple of recent articles on imitation and cultural, the dissemination of cultural innovation in some primate groups. That happens. Now, whether or not that's a meme is not clear.
Well, surely then, if it only memes apply to human, then Dawkins has argued himself into a position where humans are special.
Yeah.
Oh, he's not only argued himself into that position, he emphatically and explicitly says that. In the quote, he says, "We alone have this capacity." Not only does he say "we alone," but he says, I mean, this is a grandiose statement, something that has no place elsewhere in nature. So, yeah, he hasn't slipped into this. He's asserted it emphatically and explicitly. Yeah, we're very unique.
So we alone have something that doesn't exist. That's interesting, isn't it?
Well, we alone have something that may not have evidence of.
Yes, we'll go over to Simon here. So.
Actually, as the mic is going, can I mention one thing? What we could say is that we alone evidence a behavior that is not explicable by the evolutionary processes which successfully explain the behavior of other organisms.
Yes, right.
Now, the memes is a hypothetical response to that empirical.
But the difference in behavior is accepted.
Yeah.
Question? Yes, sir.
Got a two-part question, and the second part depends on your answer to the first part. Do you think it's consistent for a materialist to believe in an afterlife?
I was trying to think up a way of teasing Michael Roos standing in the back there. Well, yes, I do. In a couple of ways. First of all, you could be a materialist and be a theist at the same time if you were a panentheist. So you could believe that all there is matter and the properties which emerge from matter. Mind is one of those. There could be a mind of the cosmos. You could also believe that brute physical forces, and I think Frank Tipler might be an example of this. He has a book called The Physics of Immortality that argue that the way the universe works is that there will be a reconstitution of living organisms in the very properties of matter. You couldn't be a materialist and believe in afterlife if you anchored that afterlife, obviously, to an immaterial soul. But by the way, even in the Christian tradition, that the afterlife isn't anchored to an immaterial soul. It's anchored to the resurrection, which is a material proposition.
Right, picking up exactly that point then, if the afterlife is some form of material reconstruction, the cells that I have in my body now are very unlikely to have the same atoms that there were when I was a baby. When I die, my atoms are going to be spread everywhere. So whatever's reconstituted must be some sort of pattern or something like that. Now, what makes that pattern me? The thing that makes me when I'm an old person the same as me as a baby is the continuity of change throughout. But there seems to be this jump. If there was 5 copies of me recreated from this pattern, would they all be me? Would they not be?
It's an easy question.
Yeah, that's, I mean, as you know, you and I have had lunch together, there's a lot of philosophical discussion about these questions of identity and selfhood. So, first of all, it's not clear, and not everybody agrees that the you that is you now is the you that was you. So there's debate in philosophy about the continuity of self-identity, even in a human lifespan. If you believe in continuity, what would make you, and John Polkinghorne, by the way, a physicist, has some wonderful reflections on continuity and discontinuity and self-identity and eschatology, but he argues that obviously what would need to make you you is information. and you have information encoded in you in a particular form right now, and Francis talks about the language of God, and it's not clear that in some future embodiment of you that DNA is going to be the encoder of information. There may be other ways. In fact, the very rules of material existence may be different. Complicated topic. I don't know if you're a complete materialist, the question of continuity of identity becomes difficult.
Do you have a comment on that, Francis?
A separate question.
Oh, a separate question? Okay, well, just...
So one of the other explanations that's put forward by sociobiologists or atheist evolutionists in terms of radical altruism, that is self-sacrifice to members that are not part of your own group, is the idea that this is just a misfiring, that we humans generally spent most of our time in small villages interacting only with people of our own tribe, therefore not having the experience of contemplating the fact that the altruism we were learning through evolutionary processes might not apply to all humans, because the only ones we saw were our kin or those for which some reciprocation could be expected. And we just haven't gotten over that. And so we have this misfiring of an evolutionary drive in a fashion that's actually counter to what evolution would have asked us. This seems to me a little bit of a just so response, but I'm curious to know what your reaction is to that argument, because one does hear it quite a bit, especially from Dennett and Dawkins.
That's a great question, and that's a fourth tradition, which I left out. It turns out that has, there are people still making it, but it's been moved on from. I'll tell you why in a minute. But two quick comments. First of all, it may be a just so story, but science works by imagining ways that theories could apply. There's nothing wrong with the just so story. What becomes wrong is if there's never an empirical way of testing it, or if it is accepted confidently prior to testing, which actually is the case in some of the original sociobiology. Now, in this account, there are a number of ways of formulating it. So these altruistic behaviors could be, are spandrels, really, of behavioral dispositions which were adaptive in an earlier context. Turns out that that's a reasonable proposition, and what most folks think from empirical studies of altruism, in particular, for example, Holocaust rescuers, is that it is actually not the way it works. The way kin selection and reciprocity work in small social groups is that there is attachment between individuals. One spends lifetime together, or one has cues of group membership that stimulate mechanisms of attachment, and there's increasing ability to elucidate the neural mechanisms of attachment. Now let me give you a specific example from Holocaust studies. It's very clear that certain kinds of risky behaviors on behalf of Jews were attachment mediated. For example, in the camps, there are many cases of guards becoming friends with individual Jews. Maybe they played chess together, or they came from the same hometown. There are lots of cases of a guard turning the other way and letting an individual leave. That's very different from a number of other kinds of rescuing behaviors that had no history of relationship, no evidence of attachment. In fact, in her study, Kristen Monroe went back, and a number of the rescuers or harborers that she interviewed didn't even like the people. They rubbed them the wrong way. They were obnoxious and offensive to them. And furthermore, the attachment stories most often involve one-time acts. I'm turning away, you can leave. And these rescuer stories involve long-term commitments with persistent risk. And finally, there's some interesting neurological studies that suggest there are even different regions of the brain. in attachment-related or relationship-related helping behaviors and morally governed helping behaviors. So I don't think that answers it, but there's not a lot of investment right now in the pleiotropic hypothesis. It doesn't look like it accounts for the most dramatic and systematic cases of altruistic sacrifice.
Yes, it's right behind you. Yes.
Thank you. In the Garden of Eden story, we have eaten from the tree of knowledge of good and bad, right? Or what's it in English? Something like
Yeah.
Good and evil.
good and evil, right? So humans have that capacity to distinguish good and evil. But isn't it, given that, isn't it just a wrong projection to just project that on gazelles and lions and things like that? So is it in principle, well, I don't know exactly how to phrase my question, but it yields to me a feeling that it's a category error to sort of do that. So what's your comment on that?
Yeah, that's a good point, and I think I think it was Michael who made the distinction early in our time together between moral evil and non-moral evil. So yeah, when somebody talks about natural evil and the problem of gazelles and predation and suffering, I don't think anybody's saying that gazelles are evil. And they're not even saying that the existence of death and pain in the natural world is a moral evil. The question is, why would a moral God allow non-moral evil that cause such suffering? So it really becomes a problem.
But is it suffering even? Is suffering not a human conception rather than...
Well, now that's another question. I mean, you could be a Cartesian and say that animals, no matter what their constitution, are just machines. They have no affect, they have no cognition. I don't buy that. I think the problem with a parasitoid wasp eating itself out of a caterpillar doesn't bother me a lot. But I think that there's ample evidence that mammals, that any organism capable of attachment is capable of pain, and a kind of a pain that can only be described as suffering. By the way, there's some interesting neurological evidence for that. In some recent knockout mutants of mice that eliminate a gene that is, Francis may know this better than I do, but that confers the ability to feel, to attach, maternally attach, for infants to attach and to feel pleasure. They also lose the ability to evoke maternal distress cry in the absence. So it looks like the capacity to attach is intimately bound up with the capacity to feel pain. And I don't see, here's a case where I think parsimony would suggest that I want a reason from somebody else to believe that the pain that we feel is not analogous to the same to the pain that similar creatures neurologically and behaviorally feel.
Yes.
In the same theme.
Can you just wait for the mic?
Okay, yes.
Sorry, yes. Yeah.
I'll elaborate the question a little. If you discriminate between moral evil and natural evil, can an animal become moral evil? Because I've seen myself, for instance, some girls turning into real evil girls, coming into a colony of terns and become predators far more than normal girls does. So you have to...
Back to Eve,
Girls.
G-U-double-L, girl.
Dutch girl.
Herring girl.
We thought you were talking about
I'm talking about herring girls.
That may be true as well.
Not red herring girls, but
Well, yes, I think the answer to that, I don't think the animal itself is a moral agent, but I think it's very clear that animals can be inhabited by demon spirits that make them evil. Actually, I'm saying this only for the sake of
He was sleeping at
No, I don't think a non-moral agent can become evil, and I see little evidence to suggest that gulls are moral agents. Now, Frans de Waal does talk about proto-morality, that especially in primates, there are, and he doesn't go so far as to suggest that this is morality. For one thing, morality seems to involve symbolic and representation and overt representation of normative demands. But he does note that in primates, for example, there's reconciling behavior. Mark Bekoff has done a lot of work with animal play, and he notices that animals play with one another, and in the play there are always rules for play. There's mock violence, and he does notice that some animals break the rules. Now, I don't know if that makes them evil, but they break the rules and they're excluded. They're bad playmates. So if there's proto-morality, could there be proto-immorality? And I'm not being facetious.
Yeah, that's.
And I think
My question is more or less the reverse from what Franz Waal is saying, that there's some morality found in apes and other animals. So the first question is, if there's morality, if there's good in apes and cheating in apes, there might be evil.
Well, that's the dilemma of all cooperative systems. The dilemma of all cooperative systems is coordination of cooperation and policing the defectors. So there's no question that in any cooperative system there's defection. Now, that doesn't make the defection a moral failing, but in the existence of highly sophisticated social organisms that have proto-morality, well, I guess it could make sense to say there's proto-immorality. And those organisms, by the way, are excluded. They're recognized and excluded from social groups.
Isn't in this case there a very clear example of dog breeds that have become very aggressive? Then the morality is, of course, not with the dog but with the breeder. But there is a clear hereditary basis for being a very aggressive dog. Is that dog being so aggressive and violating all the rules where he was supposed to live for? Well, it's a little bit anthropomorphic. Oh, well. Can you comment on that case of aggressive breeds?
Well, I don't think aggressive breeds in dogs is a case of violating the rules of a social group. That's a case of actually obeying the rules, that humans have selected dogs, and in a sense, the rules which constrain their breeding have encouraged this particular kind of behavior. And that's the kind of behavior that has paid off reproductively for the dogs that were bred for those purposes. And I also don't think in the case of those dogs it is a moral attribute or an immoral one. It's simply it's a genetically determined behavior.
I'm afraid we're going to stop. We've got enough questions here for at least another weekend. Maybe we should have a weekend on moral evil and good and evil and that sort of thing. I think we really want to thank Jeff for 2 great talks. Thank you, Jeff.